The room held its breath the way forgotten places often do. A long, unbroken silence pressed into the walls, into the floorboards, into the dust that hovered like pale residue of what had once been a life. The investigator stepped back into the dim Tennessee farmhouse as though crossing a threshold in time rather than space. Nothing had changed since that winter night in 1988 when the case froze in place, unsolved and quietly haunting. A single lamp, still leaning on its rusted hinge, cast a faint glow across the warped hallway, as if waiting for someone to finally look again. The farmhouse had been locked for 29 years. No one had tried to clean it. No one had tried to restore it. It existed now only as a still photograph of what the world once refused to understand. Detective Marshal Roan moved slowly, his footsteps quiet, careful not to disturb the fragile order of a memory paused mid-breath. The air smelled of old wood and paper, that stale combination of time and forgotten purposes. He paused near the entryway where the first responding officers once stood, boots wet with melting sleet, radios crackling with partial words and clipped breaths. Tonight, there was no noise, only the soft hum of his own restraint. He knelt beside the narrow table near the door, where a single ceramic cup remained. A faint ring of dust circled its base, like a clock marking years instead of seconds. He imagined the victim's hand once curling around it, fingers warm, unaware. Her name had been Arielle Durant, age 27, a newcomer to the small Tennessee town, a quiet, observant woman who worked as a photography assistant and spent her evenings cataloging river stones in small labeled jars. A gentle posture, neighbors said, private but warm, a mind full of small curiosities rather than large ambitions. She lived alone and went out rarely, making her presence easy to overlook until she was no longer there. Roan's breath steadied as he looked around the main room again. The scene had always unsettled him, not because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. No chaos, no struggle, no message, just an abrupt absence, the stillness left behind when someone vanished from the world without a sound. The investigators in 1988 concluded that Arielle had been found lifeless near her desk, with no signs of forced entry and no clear motive. The evidence had been too thin, too ambiguous, too quiet. And so the case slipped into cold storage, sealed in a folder marked Durant, Arielle, unsolved. In the dim twilight of the old farmhouse, Roan brushed a thin trail of dust from the surface of a framed photograph lying face down. He turned it over gently. Arielle stood at the riverbank, her head tilted with a shy half-smile, her hair lifted slightly by a breeze the camera failed to capture. The photograph was soft at the edges, almost tender in its simplicity. But something about the placement, why was it lying here? Why face down? Pulled at him with faint insistence. The house murmured quietly around him, faint creaks, sighs of brittle wood settling. Roan felt the familiar tension of a case that never rested. It wasn't grief exactly, more like an unspoken responsibility, the weight that lingers when someone's truth remains suspended in unanswered questions. He whispered into the empty air, more to himself than to the room. Arielle, what did we miss? The silence did not answer, but it felt a little less complete. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The case reopened not with urgency, but with the slow, deliberate shift of something long dormant deciding at last to breathe. It began with a small box delivered to the precinct, a worn cardboard parcel addressed to the cold case division. No return name, no note beyond a typed label that read, 1988 Durant. Roan had handled enough old evidence to recognize the difference between dust and intent, and this box held no dust at all. Inside there were 3 items. A contact sheet of undeveloped negatives, a single key on a tarnished ring, and a brief statement typed onto a yellowing slip of paper. This belonged to her, you didn't see everything. The words were restrained, almost polite, but they pressed into Roan with unexpected weight. For decades, the Durant file had been regarded as an unfortunate dead end, the kind that made investigators quietly swallow their disappointment and move on. But now the case didn't feel finished. It felt paused. Roan arranged the items under the sterile light of the evidence lab. The contact sheet was carefully preserved, the negative frames labeled with small pencil marks. Arielle had worked with film often, capturing muted landscapes and quiet interior scenes. But these frames were different. They showed the inside of the farmhouse, the same angles Roan had walked through countless times but captured before the night everything stopped. And in two of the frames, standing near the window, was a silhouette. Not Arielle. Someone broader in the shoulders, posture tense, gaze directed away from the camera as if waiting for something. This photograph alone justified reopening the file, but it was the key that held Roan's attention. He turned it over in his hand, feeling its texture, its weight. Not a house key, not a car key, something smaller, more specific. Its notches were unusually spaced, suggesting a lockbox, a storage cabinet, something designed to protect rather than conceal. He studied the anonymous paper again. "You didn't see everything." The phrasing struck him as cautious rather than accusatory, as though the sender wanted the truth uncovered without inviting recognition. Roan considered the possibility of guilt, remorse surfacing after decades, but the tone didn't feel like confession, more like guidance, as if the sender had held this secret long enough and now stepped back into the shadows. The precinct buzzed faintly outside the evidence room, but here the air remained steady, controlled. Roan logged the items into the system with procedural calm, though his mind kept circling one question: why now? History had a way of loosening eventually. He knew, old loyalties softening, old fears losing their shape. Someone who had been silent in 1988 was no longer silent, and silence breaking, even gently, always carried significance. That evening, Roan returned to the farmhouse with the box in hand. He moved the way one approaches an echo, slow, almost reverent. The key glinted faintly under his flashlight as he examined the interior again. There had once been a locked cabinet in the study, removed years later for storage inventory. The matching lock was still intact, dusty but functional. Roan inserted the key. It turned with a soft, reluctant click. Inside was a thin folder sealed with brittle tape. He lifted it carefully, his breath held for reasons he couldn't fully articulate. Arielle's name was written across the top in her own handwriting. Underneath, a date: December 3, 1988, 2 days before she was found. Roan opened the folder with clinical precision, yet his pulse betrayed a faint tremor. Inside were notes, observations, a list of interactions that seemed harmless at first glance: errands, visitors, moments described with casual brevity. But as Roan read, a pattern emerged. Arielle had been documenting something. Not obsessively, but deliberately. She had noticed something that unsettled her enough to record it, and she had been planning to deliver these notes to someone, though the recipient's name was carefully omitted. The final page was incomplete, ending mid-sentence. Roan exhaled slowly. The silence that followed felt different now, not merely empty but waiting. The case had reopened itself. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. Roan spread the 1988 reports across his desk the way a surgeon might arrange instruments before a delicate procedure. He moved methodically, page to page, revisiting language he had nearly memorized over the years. But now, equipped with Arielle's private notes, his perspective shifted, not dramatically, but with the subtle recalibration that comes when a familiar pattern suddenly reveals an invisible thread. The original investigative team had treated the case as an isolated incident, a quiet life interrupted without clear cause. They recorded statements, photographed the area, cataloged objects, and waited for a lead that never surfaced. There had been no forced entry, no missing valuables, nothing disturbed. The absence of motive became the absence of momentum. But Arielle's notes introduced a different lens. Roan compared dates, timestamps, small notations scribbled in the margins of the reports. He noticed discrepancies that once seemed negligible, a neighbor's recollection that had shifted between interviews, a delivery log with a time stamp that conflicted with the driver's verbal account, a reference to a visitor the team never identified. One detail in particular caught his eye. A brief mention of a man who had approached Arielle's home a week before her death, asking if she needed help with winter repairs. The report dismissed him as a harmless passerby, no suspicious behavior, polite tone, no further interaction. Arielle had confirmed this in her interview, but in her private notes she referenced the same man again, not directly but subtly. "Same coat again," she wrote. "Not sure why he returns, always near the river path, always quiet." Rohn circled the line in red. The silence around that detail had been too easy to accept. He continued reading, his mind shifting between the official reports and Arielle's observations. She had noticed patterns, repeated appearances, subtle changes in routine, footsteps on the porch she didn't expect. Her entries were not fearful but attentive. She documented, she questioned, she waited. Rohn whispered the words aloud, as though giving them voice restored their significance. Not sure why he returns. Who was he? Why had he approached her more than once? Why had that detail been set aside? The more Rohn searched, the more the reports revealed their omissions. Not intentional failures, but the quiet assumptions investigators sometimes make in the absence of tangible threat. Small contradictions hid inside phrasing that felt too tidy, too resolved. He re-examined witness statements, noticing hesitation in their wording, the kind that suggested half-truths shaped by uncertainty or discomfort. Then he found something else. A photograph misfiled in the second evidence envelope. A shot taken of Arielle's desk area, showing the arrangement of her notebooks, pens, and the small wooden box she used to store undeveloped film rolls. At first glance, the image matched the others. But a second pass revealed something subtle. A single sheet of paper that appeared to have been moved between photographs, shifted slightly in angle. Rohn leaned closer. The sheet contained a faint pencil sketch, a simple outline of a face unfinished, the features incomplete. The jawline was defined, the hairline rough. Only one detail was drawn with care. The shape of the man's collar angled sharply, as if part of a uniform or structured jacket. A memory stirred. A witness had mentioned someone matching that structure. A man seen walking near the river path during the same week Arielle took the photos discovered in the new evidence box. The description had been vague, almost dismissive, absorbed into the background noise of rural life. Rohn sat back, letting the pieces settle in his mind. Nothing conclusive yet, but something coherent, something logical. Arielle had been watching someone. Not in fear, in recognition. She saw a pattern before anyone else did, and her attempt to document it was the last trace she left behind. Rohn closed the file quietly, his posture still, his breath measured. The past was no longer distant. It was preparing to speak. The board in Rohn's office filled slowly, not with dramatic revelations, but with faces and dates that had waited for their turn under the light. He pinned Arielle's photograph in the center, the riverbank image, her gaze just past the camera. Around her he placed the others, neighbors, co-workers, names that had lived in the file for years without real weight. Now they gained shape. The first was Eli Carter, age 57 now, a farmer whose land bordered Arielle's property on the west side. In 1988 he had been younger, leaner, still adjusting to life after his wife's passing. The reports described him as helpful, reliable, cooperative. He had carried boxes for Arielle when she moved in, fixed a crooked gate hinge, brought over apples in the fall. His alibi the night she died had been simple: a church meeting, then home by 10. No one had questioned it very hard. Rohn visited him at his farmhouse that afternoon. The place was tidy, the kind of order that comes from habit more than pride. Eli met him on the porch, hands rubbed clean but still stained by soil that never fully left. "I heard you reopened it," Eli said quietly. "Didn't think it would come back after all this time." "It did," Roan answered. "We found new material. I need to review a few things with you." They sat at the kitchen table. The clock on the wall ticked between pauses. "You said back then you were at church all evening," Roan began. Eli's eyes moved briefly to the window before settling back. "That's right. Meeting ran late. Winter fundraiser planning. I told the officer that." Roan nodded, filing the hesitation away. "Anyone remember you being there the whole time?" Eli's mouth tightened, a small movement. "It was a long time ago, detective. Folks came and went. I was there, that's what I know." The words were even, but his fingers traced a faint circle on the table's surface, an unconscious loop that never quite resolved. Roan did not push further. Not yet. The second photograph on the board belonged to Daniel Price, the local handyman with the dark coat mentioned in Arielle's notes. He had been in his early 30s in 1988, doing odd jobs across the county, fences, roofing patches, small repairs that didn't warrant formal contracts. In his original statement, Daniel had said he only approached Arielle's property once, offering seasonal help. She declined. The file noted no further contact. But Arielle's notes described the same coat again, and repeated appearances near the river path behind her home. Roan found Daniel at a small workshop on the outskirts of town, where tools hung in precise rows and the radio played low in the background. Daniel's hair had thinned, but his posture still held the same energy of someone always half ready to move. "You remember her?" Roan asked, setting Arielle's photograph on the workbench. Daniel studied it for a moment. "Quiet girl, like the river, never gave me trouble." "You went to her door?" "Yeah, offered some help with winterizing. She said she was fine." He shrugged, didn't push. "Did you go back?" He paused just long enough for the silence to say more than he did. "I walk that path sometimes," he admitted. "River, there for everyone. If she wrote it down like that, I guess she noticed. Didn't mean anything." "And the night she died," Roan asked, voice steady, "you said you were at a job site." "Out near the state road, fixing a porch. Old lady lives alone." He glanced at the detective. "You can ask her, I was there." "We did," Roan said. "Back then. She remembered you coming by. Her memory of when you left wasn't as clear." Daniel's jaw tightened. "People forget times. Doesn't make me anything other than a handyman who minds his work." Roan watched his eyes, not for guilt, but for distance, the subtle way someone separates themselves from an event they don't want to revisit. There was something guarded there, but not necessarily violent. More like a man used to being suspected of small things and tired of it. The third photo showed Claire Morton, now in her early 50s, who had worked with Arielle at the photography studio in town. The studio had closed years ago, but Claire remained in the area, teaching part-time at a community center. In 1988, she had been the senior assistant, experienced, efficient, already stretched between responsibilities. Arielle was the newcomer, talented, quiet, often staying late to develop personal work in the darkroom. The old reports referenced mild workplace tension, nothing unusual. Claire had described Arielle as reserved but capable, no conflict, no apparent resentment. Roan met her in a classroom that smelled faintly of paint and dry paper. Children's drawings lined the walls. Claire sat opposite him, fingers interlaced, posture straight. "You two got along?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, immediate. She was careful with details. That matters in this line of work. "You worked late together sometimes." "Sometimes," she agreed. She liked extra darkroom time. I had closing duties. "Back then, you told officers you were at the studio the evening in question, closing until about 9. "That's right." "Anyone with you?" "The owner for part of it," she said. "Then he left. I finished up, locked the door." No one saw you after that. Her eyes lowered for a moment, then lifted again. No one who would remember now. There was no drama in her answers, only a faint, almost reluctant distance when Arielle's name entered the space between them. Roan let the silence sit. "Did she ever tell you she felt watched?" he asked. Claire's expression flickered just once. She mentioned the river, people walking there at odd hours. "I told her that's small-town life. People walk where they've always walked." "You didn't think it serious?" "I didn't think it would end like it did," she said. The words were soft, controlled. "I thought it was just observation." The final name Roan added to the board was not listed as a suspect in the original file, but his presence was everywhere between the lines. Harlan Briggs, the then deputy who handled much of the early evidence work. Retired now, living quietly outside town limits. His handwriting covered margins, labels, procedural logs. His judgment had guided what was preserved and what was set aside. And now the anonymous box. Roan didn't pin Briggs's picture close to Arielle's. He placed it off to the side, connected with thin lines of string to multiple points on the board: witness interviews, evidence inventory, a note that he had been the one to seal the original cabinet. He stared at the board a long time, the room still except for the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. Each person had a motive that didn't look like one at first glance. Eli, a neighbor tied to loneliness and care, someone who may have wanted connection to stay exactly as it was. Daniel, a man seen too often near her property, whose work blurred with his presence. Claire, a coworker quietly sharing space, possibly carrying unspoken professional strain. Briggs, the officer whose decisions shaped the narrative, and whose conscience might have shifted with age. The surface of the case remained calm, but beneath it, the lines began to cross. Roan picked up his pen and underlined a single entry in Arielle's notes. Patterns matter more than intentions. He decided to move forward as she had, not with suspicion, but with close attention. One of these quiet lives hid the missing answer. The question now was which one? 5 clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The next week unfolded in measured segments: interviews, records requests, revisits to places that had not changed much and people who had. Roan started with time. He tracked Eli's church alibi through old ledgers and archived bulletins. The winter meeting in 1988 had been recorded. The schedule listed the gathering from 6 to 8:30. The original report stated Eli was present until 10. He visited the church office, where an aging pastor's assistant walked him through boxes of paper that smelled faintly of ink and mild dust. Together, they found a note from that night, a mention that Eli helped stack chairs before heading out early due to weather. No time listed, but the phrase "before 9" appeared in the margin in small handwriting. "Does that help?" the assistant asked, adjusting her glasses. "It does," Roan said quietly. Eli's certainty about the late hour had grown over the years, it seemed. The record suggested otherwise. Not proof, but a shift, a small discrepancy tugging at a larger fabric. From there, Roan examined Daniel's work history. The porch repair he mentioned had indeed taken place that week. An old invoice showed the job recorded, signed by the client. But the date stamp had been entered 2 days after the event, and the time of completion line was blank. He returned to the client, now in a care home, her memory gentle but fragile. She remembered Daniel fixing the porch. She remembered offering him tea. She did not remember whether he stayed late. "He was respectful," she said calmly, "did his work. I went to bed early that evening. Winter does that, makes you tired sooner." Roan didn't press her. The missing time around the evening wasn't enough to define anything. It only confirmed that Daniel's alibi had more space in it than the file suggested. Claire's connection unfolded differently. It was not the schedule Roan focused on, but the emotional contour of that time. He tracked down the former studio owner, who now ran a small printing service in a neighboring county. "She was good," the man said of Arielle when Roan laid the photograph on the counter. "Sharp eye, careful with exposure." "And Claire?" Roan asked. "Reliable," he replied. "Understood the business side, took care of clients. They balanced each other." "Any tension between them?" The man hesitated, then sighed. "Not the kind you put in an incident report. Just the usual, one person wanting more creative space, the other holding things steady. Arielle had been thinking of leaving, I think. She mentioned applying somewhere else. Claire wasn't thrilled. She had counted on her staying." "Did Claire know?" Roan asked. "She knew enough," he answered. "She saw the signs." Roan noted it, not because wanting someone to stay made one capable of harm, but because unspoken reliance can sometimes bend into quiet pressure. Emotional context rarely makes it into official reports. Arielle's notes, however, hinted at it, references to tension at the studio, to things unsaid on late evenings. The most revealing shift, though, came from the anonymous box. Forensic techs examined the items with patience. The contact sheet was consistent with film stock from the late 80s, carefully preserved. The key showed oxidation consistent with age. Fingerprint traces were partial and degraded, nothing direct. But the typed note, "You didn't see everything," carried a subtle clue. The typeface was from a machine model commonly used in the county sheriff's office during that period. Slight misalignments in the letters matched a particular unit that had been retired and stored for years. The machine's serial number linked to an asset log, and the last recorded user on file before it was archived had been Deputy Harlan Briggs. Roan visited him at his small home, where the television played softly in the background and a newspaper lay folded in half on the table. Briggs, now in his 70s, greeted him with a steady but faintly guarded nod. "I figured you show up," he said, easing into a chair. "Old cases have long shadows." "You sent the box," Roan said, not phrased as a question. Briggs's gaze drifted toward the window, then back. "I sent what should have been looked at properly in the first place." "Why now?" "Because time changes how heavy things feel," he replied. "Back then we told ourselves there was nothing more to do. I believed that for a while, then I didn't." Roan laid Arielle's notes on the table. "You removed these from the original cabinet." "I postponed them," Briggs said. The choice of word was careful. "Thought they'd confuse the picture. Young woman living alone, writing down every little thing that worried her about walkers by the river, about neighbors, about people she barely knew. I was afraid it would turn into a story about her instead of what happened to her." "So you decided which details mattered." Briggs accepted the criticism without flinching. "I did, and I lived with that. When I retired, I found the key in an old case box. The notes were there. I realized I'd carried that decision too long." Roan studied him. "Did you withhold them to protect someone?" Briggs's reply came slowly. "I thought I was protecting the case, but maybe I was protecting the town. People here don't like the idea that familiar faces might be part of something they don't want to see." "You knew whose pattern she was noticing," Roan said quietly. Briggs looked at the photo of Arielle for a long moment. She watched everyone, that was the thing, but there was one name she wrote more than once. "Whose?" He exhaled. "Eli." She never framed it as danger, just concern, changes in his mood, late visits, moments at the fence that didn't feel like small talk anymore. The room went still.